As the 20th century dawned and big business boomed, many had come to call the previous 20 years the Gilded Age. Wealthy families like the Carnegies, Vanderbilts, and Rockefellers enjoyed the fruits of big business and the fruits of others' labor. But for most American families, it was far from a Gilded Age, as they incurred the harsh realities of sweatshops, slums, child labor, corruption in government and business, disease, and racial prejudice. As Americans ushered in a new century, they began to demand change, equality, reform, and the Progressive Era was born. The roots of the Progressive Era reforms began many years earlier. For over 80 years, presidents and federal politicians had rewarded their supporters with lucrative government jobs. It was called patronage, or the spoils system, from an old war slogan. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the American public grew increasingly disgusted with government corruption and favoritism. Some members of the Republican Party began a reform movement. Nicknamed mugwumps, they were influential Republicans who refused to support their party's presidential candidate, who they believed opposed reform. With the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by Charles Guiteau, whom he had refused to hire for a government position, the outcry for an end to patronage reached a crescendo. Now President Charles A. Arthur convinced Congress to pass the Pendleton Act, establishing a federal civil service. Federal workers would now be hired based on competitive exams rather than political influence. Slowly, civil service regulations were expanded to almost all government jobs. The mugwump concept of an honest government based on merit laid the groundwork for progressive reform, as did two other political groups, the Populists and the Socialists. After the Civil War, many Americans returned to or began farming. But over the next decades, there was an overproduction of farm goods. With more supply than demand, prices plummeted lower and lower. At the same time, the cost of seed, fertilizer, and railroad transportation increased, leaving more and more farmers little money to support their families and still pay their debts to bankers. In protest, farmers began to organize political parties. Of them, the Populist Party emerged as the most powerful. The Populists supported an income tax based on earnings to support the government, rather than the tariffs then charged to farmers and businesses. They demanded a shorter workday, government loans to farmers, the direct election of state senators, secret ballot voting, and other election reforms. But Republican William McKinley defeated the populist-supported presidential candidate, Democrat William Jennings Bryan, in 1896, and the Populist Party, if not its causes, faded. By 1900, another political movement emerged, demanding even more radical change, an end to capitalism itself. Eugene V. Debs was one of the founders of this new political force, the Socialists. Socialists felt that the industrial age and its capitalist culture was responsible for the wide disparity between the handful of rich and the working poor of America. Debs's proposed solution was to eliminate private ownership. Many middle and upper-class Americans disagreed with the Socialists. They too felt that big business was out of control and American workers were being taken advantage of. These progressives felt they could improve capitalism by making government more responsive to social inequities. Progressives wanted instead to reform government and business, ensuring decent working conditions and wages and fair governmental rule. The progressive movement gained momentum and followers as Americans read the work of writers and journalists who exposed corruption in government and business, and described the deplorable life of many working-class Americans. These writers became popularly known as muckrakers, from a character in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress who raked up the mud and muck of the world. Author Upton Sinclair shocked the nation with his graphic description of the filth and appalling working conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants. Ida Tarbell described the cutthroat tactics used to eliminate competition by big businesses like Standard Oil. Jacob Riis, an immigrant himself, wrote a first-hand account of life in the slums, while Lincoln Steffens, considered the leader of the muckraking movement, exposed the corruption so rampant in city government. As Americans read these muckraking books and magazine articles, they became not only aware of the country's problems, they demanded and supported reforms in both business and government. A major reform governor, Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin, enlisted experts to help him improve his state's government. Soon, other states followed his lead.
My goal is not to smash corporations, but to drive them out of politics.
Meanwhile, on the local level, new forms of city government emerged. After a tidal wave devastated the city of Galveston, Texas, a 5-member commission was set up to rebuild the city, rather than politicians. This commission system of government proved so successful that in just 14 years, some 400 other cities had followed Galveston's lead. Still other cities adopted the council-manager form of government. Residents elect a city council to make laws, and the council appoints a manager, usually a professional public administrator, to run the city's various departments. Both of these systems help to eliminate corruption in local government. Meanwhile, state government reforms moved forward. Other progressive governors, such as Charles Evan Hughes of New York and Hiram Johnson of California, were joined by ordinary citizens like William S. Uren of Oregon. With his urging, Oregon adopted 4 election reforms. The secret ballot, where voters individually get an official ballot and vote in a private booth. The initiative, giving voters the right to put issues on a ballot for a vote. The recall, which granted voters the right to remove an elected official. And perhaps most importantly, the direct primary, in which voters choose candidates for office rather than political party leaders. The direct primary led to the adoption of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, giving Americans the ability to directly elect their state senators. Many of the demands of the earlier populist movement were finally coming to fruition as state and local governments became more responsive to citizens and tried to eliminate the influence of big business.
The growth of large business is merely survival of the fittest.
Although progressives wanted to preserve capitalism, they feared that the concentration of huge wealth and power in the hands of a few industrialists like Rockefeller was dangerous. As proof, they cited the millions of men, women, and children who labored for low pay and long hours in hazardous working conditions. Progressives advocated government regulation of business, and over time, laws protecting workers and working conditions were adopted. Still, it took until the late 1930s before the Supreme Court decided that a federal minimum wage was constitutional. A turning point in awareness of the plight of working Americans occurred in 1911. A tragic fire in a New York City garment factory left 126 young immigrant workers dead, trapped behind locked doors at their sewing machines. Many of the women jumped to their deaths or were burned beyond recognition. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company were indicted for manslaughter, and new laws were passed to protect workers from slave labor conditions. Other progressives felt that the problems of the country demanded moral, not legislative solutions. Believing that the drinking of alcohol led to moral collapse, crime, and poverty, organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union demanded and received a constitutional amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol in the United States. Progressive Jane Addams took a slightly different view. she co-founded a settlement house in the slums of Chicago, a grassroots approach to solving neighborhood problems. Hull House and other settlement houses provided a kind of community center where neighbors, especially immigrants, could gather to learn English, obtain medical help, and learn to solve their own problems.